أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. After covering the chapter of Tayammum, the author rahimahullah goes on to talk about the subject of menstruation, which we call haid. So in the text, Akhdari says Faslun fil haid, which is the section in the section regarding menstruation. Now, when dealing with menstruation, we're going to separate women into three different categories. The first woman is called mubtada'atun. Mubtada'atun generally refers to a woman who sees menses for the first time. So a woman who sees menses for the first time, we're going to call her al-mubtada'u. And the second class of woman is called al-mu'atadatun. Al-mu'atadatun generally refers to a woman who has the customary norm. So after a woman sees menses for the first time, she's going to be considered a mu'atada, which means now that she's going to be considered somebody who has a custom. What do we mean by custom? A specific amount of days in which she usually sees menstruation. And then the third category will be hamil. Hamil means a woman who is pregnant. So in terms of menstruation, we split women into three categories, and the reason why we split them into three categories is because each woman has some separate set of rules in terms of how they determine what is considered menstruation or not. So we have three categories. The first one is called mubtada'atun, which means a woman who sees menstruation for the first time. Then the second one is called mu'atadatun, which generally means a woman, we generally label a woman mu'atadatun, meaning that she has a customary norm, and that happens after after the first time she sees menstruation. Then we have hamil. A hamil means a woman who is pregnant. And so in most cases, women do not see menstrual blood when they're in the state of pregnancy, but because the chances are possible and sometimes it does occur, then the fuqaha, the ulama, the scholars of Islam talk about the issue, so that if the matter was to occur, although it is highly unlikely, then we have an answer for the matter. So in terms of menstruation, we want to know what is the longest amount of days, or what is the least amount of days that we can consider something menses. For example, in some other madhabs, in order for something to be considered, in order for the blood coming out to be considered menses, it has to be present for 3 days. Some scholars in another madhab will say that it has to be present for a day and a night. According to the Maliki method, once a woman sees at least a drop of blood, that will be considered sufficient in order for it to be considered menstruation. So we don't have to wait a day and a night in order for it to be considered menstruation. If a woman bleeds, then we're going to consider whatever she sees, even if it's a drop, as a day of menses. So the least amount of menses for all categories of women is considered to be a drop of blood. So any category of women who see a drop of blood, then they're going to consider that menstruation without any doubt. Now, in terms of the highest amount of days that there can be menstruation, the highest that it can ever go is 15 days. So 15 days is the maximum time for all women in which menstruation could be considered, the blood that's coming out could be considered menstruation. So for example, reading from the text, Al-Akhdari says, وَالنِّسَاءُ مُبْتَدَأَةٌ مُعْتَادَةٌ وَحَامِلٌ. He says women are of three kinds. Mu'tadatun, which we said is the woman who sees menstruation for the first time. Then he says mu'tadatun, and we said that that is the woman that has that sees menstruation for the second time, and we consider mu'tada because now her menses is going to be considered to her customary cycle. And the third woman, he says wa hamilun. And then he says wa aktharul haid للمبتدأة 15 يوما وللمعتادة عادتها. So he says, and the highest amount or the highest duration of menstruation for a woman who sees menstruation for the first time, للمبتدأة is 15 يوما, is 15 days. So if a girl sees menstruation for the first time, then the longest that her menstrual cycle can be is 15 days. So for example, let's say a woman sees menstruation for the first time and she bleeds 5 days, 10 days, and then she bleeds 11 days, and on the 15th day she's still bleeding. If the 16th day comes and she's still bleeding, that 16th day is not considered blood, but it's considered something else. So if she were to still be bleeding on the 16th day, she would go and make ghusl, she would go and wash and make prayer, because that blood is not considered part of her menstrual cycle. So understand this important point, that a woman who sees blood for the first time, the longest duration of her menstruation can only be 15 days. And so whatever shows up after 15 days is not to be considered part of her menstrual cycle. And whatever is not part of her menstrual cycle means that she's obligated to pray, because that blood that she sees is not considered menses. So she must make ghusl and then perform her prayers, and as well to do her fasts during Ramadan. Then he goes on, وَلِلْمُعْتَادَةِ عَادَتُهَا فَإِن تَمَادَ بِهَا الدَّمُ زادت 3 أيام ما لم تجاوز 15 يوما. Here we move on to the second category, which is a woman who has a customary norm. And a woman who has a customary norm, the longest duration of her menstruation is the length of her customary norm. For example, if a woman has a customary norm of menstruating for 7 days, then 7 days is going to be her maximum duration. So for example, a woman bleeds for 7 days, then we're going to say that her maximum duration is 7 days. But there's another point to add here, which Al-Akhdari mentions here, that if the woman, for example, were to for example, her menstruation was 7 days, and she continued bleeding after 7 days. According to our madhab, she is going to wait 3 extra days in order to see if her menstruation stops. So, for example, a woman's customary norm duration is 7 days. Then, so her menstruation comes and she waits day number 1, day number 2, all the way up until 7 days, which is the end of her customary duration. And then on the 8th day, she's still bleeding. We're going to say that before she makes ghusl and continues to pray, what she's going to do is she's going to wait the 8th day, the 9th day, and the 10th day. And if she's still bleeding on the 11th day, then the 11th day is not going to be considered part of her menses, so she's obligated to make ghusl and pray and fast. So one more time to be clear, a woman who has a customary norm, the longest duration of her menses is going to be the number of her customary norm. And her customary norm, for example, that we gave is 7 days. So if a woman after 7 days, on the 8th day, she still sees blood, we say to her, wait 3 days to see if this blood discontinues. So that blood during the waiting days, we're going to consider it as part of her menses. So on the 8th day, she's still bleeding. On the 9th day, she's still bleeding. On the 10th day, she's still bleeding. On the 11th day, we're going to say that is no longer considered part of your menses, and so you must pray, and you must pray and fast after making ghusl. So that's what a woman is supposed to do. That's what a woman is supposed to do when she has a customary norm and it goes past her fixed duration. So that's why Al-Akhdari says walil mu'tada. And as for the woman who has a customary norm, the longest duration of her menstruations is adatuha, is her customary norm. And then Al-Akhdari explains the mas'ala that we give. He says, فَإِن تَمَادَ بِهَا الدَّمُ, and if that blood were to continue, biha, meaning that it was to continue past her customary norm, زَادَتْ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ مَا لَمْ تُجَاوِزْ 15 يَوْمٍ, then she is requested to wait 3 extra days to see if the blood is going to stop. So as we mentioned before, those 3 extra days that she counts is going to be considered part of her menses. Now, another point that Al-Akhdari mentions here, which we won't forget to mention, he says, مَا لَمْ تُجَاوِزْ 15 يَوْمٍ. The condition that has to be met in order for the woman to wait 3 days is as long as waiting 3 days does not end up to past 15 days. Because as we mentioned before, menstruation under all circumstances, except in the issue that we're going to mention a little later as an exception to the rule, a woman's menstruation does not pass more than 15 days. So, for example, we said, for example, the woman of 7 days, she's going to wait 3 days. But let's say a woman's customary norm is 13 days. For example, every month she sees menstruation for 13 days. But on the 14th day, she keeps bleeding. In this circumstance, we're going to say that she's only going to wait for the 13th day. She's only going to wait for the 14th day and then the 15th day. After the 15th day, meaning when the 16th day comes, she's going to fast and prayer. Why? Because here she's not permitted to wait 3 extra days. Because if she waits 3 extra days, then that means her menses will be 16 days. And so we said that the highest duration of menses can only be 15 days in this circumstance. So again, if a woman has a customary norm of 13 days and she still continues bleeding, we're going to say under this circumstance, she can only wait for 2 days. And she's not going to wait for 3 days, because waiting for 3 days is going to mean that her menstruation will be 16 days, which is not possible except for the rule that we're going to mention a little later. Now, another example for the sake of clarification, let's say her menstruation or her general customary duration is 14 days. So after 14 days, the blood is still bleeding. We're going to tell her here, you cannot wait 3 days, you can only wait 1. Because after waiting the 15th day, if she waits the 16th day and the 17th day, then she's going to pass the 15-day mark. So what it generally means, to make it simple, is that we're going to request her to wait as long as that waiting period does not surpass 15 days. That's why Al-Akhdari says, فَإِن تَمَادَ بِهَا الدَّمُ. If the blood is to surpass her customary norm, what is she supposed to do? زَادَتْ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ. She is to wait 3 extra days. مَا لَمْ, under the condition, مَا لَمْ تُجَاوِزْ 15 يَوْمًا. As long as that waiting does not lead to waiting more or passing 15 days. So moving on, talking about the last woman, which is al-hamil, the woman who is pregnant. We're going to split her into 3 categories. We're going to consider the woman who's pregnant from 0 to 3 months to the end of 3 months. A woman who's pregnant from the beginning all the way up until the end of the 3rd month, we're going to say that the rule that she takes is the rule of the woman who's mu'tada, meaning she's going to follow her customary norm only. So a woman who's pregnant for 3 complete months or less, then we're going to say that she follows the rule like any other woman who has a customary norm. But after 3 months, meaning from the beginning of the 4th month to the end of the 6th month, we're going to say that her the highest duration of her menstruation is 15 to 30 days, right? So 15 to 30 days is her highest duration of menstruation. If you recall, we just mentioned before that under all circumstances, a woman does not, a woman's menstruation cannot pass 15 days, and we said that there's an exception to the rule, and this exception to the rule is what we're mentioning here in terms of the hamid, the woman who is pregnant. So, as we mentioned, from 0 to the end of 3 months, she's going to be like any other regular mu'tada woman. But once she hits the 4th month, all the way up to the end of the 6th month, if she were to see menstruation during this time, we will say that the longest duration of her menses will be anywhere between 15 to 30 days, which means that if she sees menses for more than 15 days, we're still going to consider it menses if it's coming out. And under this circumstance, make a side note very clearly, under this circumstance, we're not going to necessitate for her that she should wait 3 days. In this circumstance, there's no waiting 3 days. So as whenever the blood cuts in between 15 to 30 days or less, we're going to tell her from here, as soon as the blood stops, to pray, then fast. To make ghusl and pray and fast. After that, we have the woman, the pregnant woman from the beginning of the 7th month up until she gives birth. We're going to say that her menstruation goes from 20 days. It can be anywhere between, the highest duration that she can have can be anywhere between 20 days to 25 days. So anywhere from between 20 days to 25 days, then that will be considered menses for her. So as you mentioned before, as if she's 7 to 9 days pregnant and she sees menstruation for anywhere between up to the duration of 25 days, all of it will be considered menstruation. So that's the three categories of a woman in terms of menstruation. Now, Akhdari is going to mention a very important issue, which is the issue of what they call talfiqu ayam ad-dam, which means joining the days of menstruation. When it happens that a woman sees her menstruation, then it stops, then it comes back, then it stops. So let's strike an example before going to the text. And the example that we're talking about is, let's say, for example, a woman has a norm of 7 days, meaning her menstruation occurs for 7 days. But the circumstance happens that, for example, she sees blood for 2 days, for example. So she sees blood for 2 days, then it stops. And then she wakes up the next morning, she wakes up 2 days later and the blood comes back. Now the question that we're going to answer here is that blood that comes back, is that considered part of her first menses or no? So one more time, she sees blood for 2 days. Her duration is 7 days, but she sees blood for 2 days and then it stops. So when it stops, as soon as it stops, she's going to make ghusl and she's going to pray. So 3 days later or 2 days later or 4 days later, the blood comes back. Is that blood considered part of her menstruation or is it a new menses? The rule that Al-Akhdari is going to tell you here is that any time a woman's blood stops and it comes back before 15 days, make sure you analyze this point. Anytime the blood comes back before 15 days, then that blood is considered part of her original menses. So let's strike an example with that now. A woman sees her menses for 2 days and the menstruation stops. Then after 5 days, what we're concerned about here is anything before 15 days. So the blood comes back before 15 days. what she's going to do is the blood that comes back now, she's going to count that. She's going to count the days of the returning blood to the days of the first blood. So she bled first for 2 days, and then some days later she started to bleed again. The minute she starts bleeding again, she's going to consider that the third day of her menses. So she will consider that the third day of her menses, and so she will continue counting her days of menses. Here we're not concerned whether this happens all the time. For example, let's say she bleeds 1 day, and then the blood stops, and 10 days goes by, and then the blood comes back again. As soon as that blood comes back again, she's going to say, this is my second day of menses. Now let's just say she's on her second day of menses, and she wakes up now, and she's not bleeding. And then 10 more days goes by, and then it comes back again. When it comes back again, she's going to say that this is my third day of menses. So what we mean here, talfiq, means that she's going to join the days of her menses as one menses as long as 15 days does not pass. That is the meaning of Al-Akhdari when he says فَإِن تَقَطَعَ الدَّمُ. فَإِن تَقَطَعَ الدَّمُ means if the blood were to discontinue. He says, then what's the answer? لَفَقَتْ أَيَامَهُ. Then she is to gather the days together. As I mentioned, she's to gather her days together, meaning she's supposed to count all of those days of her menses together. حَتَّى تُكَمِّلَ عَادَتَهَا. Until she completes her customary duration. So here Al-Akhdari, because it's a very basic text, he didn't mention the fact that you're only going to gather those days together if there's less than 15 days between them. So to summarize this issue of fiqh, as we mentioned before numerous times, as long as 15 days or less have occurred between the time that the blood has stopped and it returned, then she's going to gather those days together and count them to the first days of her bleeding and menstruation. And here we're not concerned about whether or not the blood stops and comes back, even if it happens 5 or 6 times. As long as 15 days does not occur between each time the blood returns, then it will be considered part of her first menses. So the question is, then what happens if she sees blood after 15 days? So if she sees blood, make sure you take a note here. If she sees blood after 15 days, now we're going to consider that blood as a new menses. So for example, let's say her customary norm is 7 days. Her customary norm is 7 days, and she bleeds for 2 days. Right? And she were to bleed for 2 days. Then 15 days were to go by, and on the 16th day, she began to bleed again. In this circumstances, because 15 days have gone by, we're going to say that this is what the blood that she sees is a new menses. Now, another important point here that we're going to make is that when we say a woman's customary norm, a woman is going to consider her customary norm according to the amount of her previous menstruation. For example, sometimes women have a duration of 6 days, sometimes some months it's 7 days. So for example, let's just say a woman has the duration of menses for 6 days, right? And then she's still bleeding, and she does her 3 days of waiting, and then the blood stops, which means that her total duration was 9 days. So the following month, when menses comes now, her normal duration is going to become 9 days. The general principle here is that a woman is going to consider her customary norm based on the duration of her last menstruation. So that's how a woman determines the length of her menstruation.